Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you books to decide, are they worth reading of a second breakfast? Or do they deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? They make it very hard to keep Mount Doom out here, which is the main reason it hasn't been in the last few videos. That one time I had it on the couch, they did not like that, because that's her spot. Anyways, it's time to decide. Today's book is Firefly, the Magnificent Nine. Very disappointed in all you all. Not even one guess on my TBR. Kind of killed the whole point of the month, but oh well. It happens. Anyways, Firefly, the Magnificent Nine is an expanded universe novel for the cult classic sci-fi series Firefly, and was published on March 19th of 2019. The book was written by James Lovegrove, and it says there was a consulting editor of Joss Whedon, although to what degree, I don't know. I know with certain things like this, just having the name of the person originally involved tends to be a big selling point, so take that for what you will. And these books continue the story of the crew of the Firefly between the periods when the series was canceled and when the movie Serenity took place. This is book 2 of 8 that I could find of the Firefly books that have currently at least been published. And really, that's all I gotta say on the background of it. It's hard to really talk about this series without going into a big long rant about Firefly in and of itself. And that could be a video and all on its own. So
best TV show ever, so of course, canceled.
With that being said, here's your report card. And then we move on to the cover. Now, in terms of a cover, this book is, decent enough. Looking at this cover in hindsight, both after reading this book and after seeing what the other covers of the series look like, it's clearly trying to invoke the sci-fi and western setting with its cover. Leaning more into the western look with these, sun-stained papers with torn edges at the top. Even the cover beneath this dust cover is a leather brown. So when it scoots up and down, it blends in very well with where the paper is torn right up here. Now, as for the rest of the cover, it still holds up as well. It's not really what I would call special, but it does do the job. Since Jayne Cobb is our emotional through line through this book, he's featured front and center, let me make sure I'm pointing, with his awful woolen hat. We see the desert land between them, and who we can only assume is his old flame, Temperance McCloud, beside him, smaller, with her back to Cobb and hidden in the shadows. It's all very nice, even though it uses the likeness of Adam Baldwin. It's clearly art and not just a picture. Now, I've stated before that although it can work for covers, I don't like live action pictures as cover material. I think art and stuff like that should be used. Yeah, that's all really I gotta say. Moving on to the synopsis of the book. The name and the Western theme pretty much give away what the synopsis is gonna be, but just to go through it, it's sort of an homage to, obviously, the Magnificent Seven story. After Jayne Cobb gets a message from an old flame by the name of Temperance Jones, now known as Temperance McCloud, asking for his help with the deal with a bandit named Elias Vandal and his group of vandals, and his group of, let me try to reword that. Asking for his help to deal with a man named Elias Vandal and his group of bandits known as the Scourers, who are threatening to take the town of Coogan's Bluff water supply from them. Now, they live on a planet called Thetis, which, despite its ironic naming, its most precious resource is water. Jayne, still having feelings, and with a little help from Inara, manages to convince the crew to take the job, and before long the Serenity arrives. After being almost knocked out of the sky by a heat-seeking missile and being grounded, they find Temperance, discover that she has a daughter, and that the daughter is not only named Jayne, without a Y, but shares a striking similarity to their resident tough guy. And it's not long before Jayne, with a Y, realizes he's fighting for more than just old flings. And from there, that's about where I'll dive into the review. All in all, I like this read. It doesn't suffer from what Peacekeepers, the Star Trek book I read, did, in that it feels like a bit... Yes, I love you. It doesn't suffer from what Star Trek Peacekeepers did, in that it feels like a tossed script that was rewritten, but in fairness, that was also likely because Firefly never made it long enough to have an abundance of those. It does very well to immerse you in the space western world that is presented to you. I wouldn't say you need to be a hardcore fan of the series in order to enjoy this book, but I would also warn you that you might at least need a cursory knowledge of the crew of the Serenity before you dive in. It doesn't exactly hold your hand on who they might be as you read. Apart from that, the story is fairly interesting. I'm glad to see it didn't just recycle the plot of the Magnificent Seven like I was worried it was going to do. It definitely played the hand it was dealt and shuffled it about that you didn't really know what exactly to expect as time went on, though you're fairly sure certain things aren't going to go the way you expect. There are a few twists here and there that genuinely caught me off guard, although to be completely fair, ignore that, one of those twists is only because the story kind of lies to you. The others are so obvious you probably will pick them up immediately because, well, yeah, how else is this going to go? So obviously, I'm going to have to spoil the book a couple places here and there. But to prove my point of that, the identity of who Jayne, without the Y, McCloud's real father is. The book spends a majority of its run trying to have us, as well as almost all the characters in the book, operating under the assumption that Jayne is Jayne's... Okay, that's not a confusing statement at all. Jayne without a Y is Jayne with a Y's daughter. However, when Jayne with a Y begins to talk about leaving the crew so he can stay on Thetis to be a real father to his daughter, you know right away there's going to be a twist coming. You know right away that the story's already going to end with a contrived, despite everything, she wasn't actually his daughter. And it does. Because it actually turns out that the main villain, Elias Vandal, is Jayne's father. But that's something I'm going to have to go into a little later to talk about. So, to move on. And to explain the twist that was a lie. This one is somewhat forgivable, but I do still very much hate twists that rely on the fact that you're shown false information in order for it to work. Throughout our story, our characters are accompanied by Temperance McCloud, for her daughter Jayne, without the Y, and Mayor McGillis. Now, instead of being the corrupt, cowardly politician that the mayors of these kinds of towns in stories are often shown to be, McGillis actually seems to be on our hero's side. And while not a fighter, he is at least an honorable man, willing to go back and die with his town when it seems like the crew of the Serenity failed to save it. It even shows a chapter from his perspective as he evades Vandal's gang and tries his best to find supplies to survive the Scourer's blockade. And that's where it lies to you, because it's revealed later on that McGillis actually is the cowardly, portly, corrupt politician who sold out Coogan's Bluff before our heroes even arrived, and has been doing his best to sabotage our heroes and assist Elias throughout the entire book. However, the reason this fails is that the previous chapter I talked about, the one where he's evading Elias's scourers and trying to find supplies, wouldn't work if he was on the villain's side the entire time, because it shows his internal thoughts throughout this entire chapter, and those internal thoughts are fear of what's going to happen if the scourers catch him, which conflicts with his later attitude where he's at least going to survive the death of Coogan's Bluff because of his assistance. But I mean, apart from that thing, I think that the real issue with this book that I think may drive a lot of people from this book is gonna be its usage of a certain very sensitive subject. To be clear, before I continue, I'm going to put up this trigger warning on screen for about 10 seconds. If these topics are too much for you, please feel free to skip to the timecode below. So the story has a very liberal usage of SA in this. While to a degree that I understand it, as it's trying to emulate the lawless Western society that existed and things like this would happen, it gets a little much as the story goes on. Lovegrove just feels like he just needs to keep reminding us that our villain loves to our women, and the younger the better to him, to the point that he threatens Temperance's daughter, who is confirmed to only be 13, and River Song, who I believe isn't much older, with slavery of that kind for years, until he gets bored of them, and then he'll just give them to his men. And it gets to the point where it just gets gratuitous. There are very few scenes when the main villain is involved, and you're not learning about a time that he has essayed another woman, or how his men like to kidnap young girls for this purpose, to the point that by the end, I just kind of wanted our crew to execute his entire band for these horrible crimes that we know they've committed at this point. And while I say the usage of it is much better than someone like Marion Zimmer Bradley's usage of it in Spellsword, I would still say that it gets gratuitous. I honestly would argue that this is one of those books that needs a genuine trigger warning with just how much it lingers on these subjects. It's also noticeable that it does the cardinal sin of this and focuses more on how it affects the men in the women's life rather than the woman herself, which unfortunately is what happens a lot of the time with the usage of this certain subject, and it's ultimately what I think one of the biggest issues when it comes to the usage of this subject. So to move on from that to a degree, hopefully out of the trigger warning necessity, in addition to what I just talked about, sort of combined with this, but also left heavy, is I don't necessarily agree with some of the decisions or like the topics on this. To give quick context, Jayne is shown to be much dumber and unperceptive compared to how I remember him in the show, which where several things that are plainly obvious to literally everyone has to be spelled out for him. Like, I could understand the daughter thing simply for the sake of comedy, but when it's actually the serious material mentioned before, and it's like, come on, dude, not even a rock is this dense. Like, if we put you in a lake, you're gonna sink straight to the bottom. But in terms, I guess it's just a couple character decisions that I don't really agree with that the narrative seems to support as the right decision. For example, one of the things that the books end with, after the revelation that Jayne, without the Y, who her real father is, for some reason it's considered unacceptable to let her go on thinking that Jayne, with the Y, is her father, despite her biological father being so much worse that I think it would be mentally scarring for any kid to know that was the dad. It also kind of feels like it sends a bad message that Jayne immediately, like, basically washes his hands of the young girl the moment he finds out he isn't blood related to her, going from plotting his entire life on Thetis so he can help raise her to leaving without a second thought about the whole thing because of that. Personally, I would have felt that the story could have been far more interesting and probably would have added a bit more to Jayne's depth as a character if he did have a family on Thetis, but continued to travel with the Serenity in order to make money with them because he doesn't have the soul for farm work. And Thetis in itself isn't really a wealthy town. In the end, it's not a terrible book, but it was a bit lesser than I was hoping for. I would give it a solid 7 out of 10. Yeah, with that being said, there isn't much else I can say about this book. Pretty good on my rating. It's a decent work if you're definitely into the series. You might not appreciate it as much without having read it, but to be fair, that's pretty much true of any expanded universe book. You'll probably also find that constant usage of that one subject I discussed is a bit off-putting for me and probably for a fair amount of other people. It's not, I wouldn't say it ruins it, and it never goes super in-depth on these themes, more just kind of mentioning it's happening. So I will give it that credit alone. So yeah, overall, it'd be a fun read, but but what should have been an 8 out of 10 ends up being only a 7 out of 10. Which, doesn't sound too bad, but it's still a point lower. That'll be the last main TBR book of this year. I know I read one more in my minor TBR, but I wasn't able to quite get to it before this month ended, so unfortunately, I won't be doing that. That thumping you probably hear right next to the mic is my dog scratching herself. Don't eat your toy. With that being said, with this month coming to an end, I guess it's just time to move on. I'll see you guys next month for the spooky time.